The bank manager's name was Patricia. She had kind eyes and a trembling voice when she called me into her office. I knew something was wrong the moment she asked me to sit down. I had been banking at the same branch on Cleveland Avenue for 31 years. Patricia had been there for 16 of them. We knew each other's families, exchanged Christmas cards, and she always asked about my fishing trips. That morning, she looked like she was about to deliver a eulogy. She closed the door behind us, which she never did. She sat down across from me and folded her hands on the desk. She took a deep breath and said, "Mr. Donovan, I have some very difficult news." I remember thinking it was a scam. Some sort of identity theft, maybe a data breach. I had seen those stories on the news, old folks getting cleaned out by hackers in foreign countries. I told Patricia not to worry. I had insurance. I had fraud protection. I was a careful man. I checked my statements every month, even the ones I didn't need to. I had never missed a red flag. Patricia shook her head and slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a transaction history for my primary savings account, the one I had opened back in 1992 when I was just getting the business off the ground. The number at the bottom was 0. Not close to 0. Not a few thousand left. $0.00. I stared at the paper for a long time. I blinked a few times. I took off my reading glasses and cleaned them on my shirt. The 0 did not change. I asked Patricia if there was a mistake. I asked her to check the computer again. She nodded and turned her monitor toward me. I saw every single withdrawal, logged in chronological order, all from the previous Tuesday. The amounts were large. 50,000 here, 100,000 there. The final transaction was for a little over $400,000, which cleaned out the rest. Every transfer was labeled with the same authorization code. My authorization code. The one that was supposed to be kept in a secure file that only my son and I had access to. I felt my chest tighten. I put my hand over my heart and took a slow breath. Patricia reached across the desk and put her hand on my arm. She asked if I needed water. I said no. I asked her who authorized the transfers. She hesitated. She looked at the screen again, scrolling up to a field that listed the contact name. I already knew the answer before she said it. "Richard Donovan," she said softly. "Your son." He called the main line on Monday morning. He identified himself with the security passphrase and requested a series of wire transfers to a joint account at a different institution. We followed standard procedure. "We sent a confirmation text to your primary phone number." He confirmed the text. I pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my messages from the previous week. I had received a text from the bank on Monday afternoon. I remembered seeing it. I had been in the middle of replacing a water pump on my boat. I glanced at the screen, saw the bank name, and assumed it was a routine alert about my monthly statement. I had swiped it away without reading the full message. Richard knew I would do that. He knew I hated getting notifications on my phone. He knew I was old school, that I preferred paper statements and face-to-face conversations. He exploited that. He exploited every single thing he knew about me. I asked Patricia to print the full record. She asked if I wanted to call the police. I told her not yet. I needed to think. I took the printout and walked out of the bank. I got in my truck and just sat there for a while. The engine was off. The Florida sun was beating down through the windshield. The sweat was rolling down my back. I read every single line of that printout 3 times. I totaled the numbers in my head. $462,000. That was my retirement, my safety net, the money I was going to use to travel with Ellen. She had been gone 5 years, but I still kept the account in both our names. I never had the heart to remove her. Richard knew that too. He knew I kept everything the way she left it. I drove home in a daze. I didn't stop for groceries. I didn't stop for gas. I just drove the familiar route through the neighborhoods I had watched grow from empty fields into subdivisions. I pulled into my driveway and looked at the house. It was a modest place, nothing like the mansions Richard and Miranda had been eyeing. It was a 3-bedroom ranch with a screened-in porch and a boat shed out back. Ellen and I bought it in 1985 for $60,000. We raised our family there. We celebrated every success and weathered every storm in that house. It was paid off. It was mine. But suddenly, everything else was gone. I went inside and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were shaking. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall. That was when the phone rang. It was Richard. I almost answered it. I had the phone in my hand. I could see his name on the screen. I could hear his voice in my head, casual and cheerful, like nothing had happened. I pressed the ignore button. I turned the phone face down on the table. I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked out the window and saw Richard's new Tesla parked in front of my mailbox. He got out of the car and walked toward the front door. He was wearing a linen shirt and expensive sunglasses. He had a smile on his face. I did not open the door. I stood behind the curtain and watched him knock. He knocked again, harder this time. He called out my name. "Dad, you home?" I heard him jiggle the doorknob. The door was locked. I had always kept it locked, even when I was home. It was a habit from the old days when the neighborhood wasn't so safe. He jiggled it again. He sighed loudly. I could hear him mutter something under his breath. Then he took out his phone and started typing. A moment later, my phone buzzed on the kitchen table. It was a text from him. "Hey Dad, stop by to say hi. Miranda and I are having a little get-together tonight. You should come. It'll be fun." Fun. He had taken every cent I had, and he wanted me to come to his party. I felt a cold anger settle in my chest. It was different from the hot rage I expected. It was calm. It was clear. It was the kind of anger that had kept me alive through 2 tours in the Navy. It was the kind of anger that had helped me build a company from scrap metal and stubbornness. I walked back to the kitchen and pulled out the financial records I kept in a fireproof safe under my desk. I had copies of everything. Tax returns, business valuations, real estate deeds. I had kept meticulous records for 40 years because I believed in order. I believed in being prepared. I had never been so grateful for that habit in my entire life. I called my lawyer, a man named Harold who had handled my business contracts since the 1980s. Harold was older than me. He had a gravelly voice and a no-nonsense attitude. He listened to the whole story without interrupting once. When I finished, he asked me 3 questions. First, did I have documentation of Richard's access to the accounts? I said yes. Second, did I have proof that the transfers were made without my explicit verbal consent? I said I had the text message I had ignored, which showed I never responded to the confirmation request. Harold said that was crucial. Third, he asked me what I wanted to do. He asked if I wanted to press charges. I told him I didn't want to put my son in jail. I wanted to put him in his place. Harold understood that. He told me to come to his office the next morning. He said we had options. He said I was not broke. I still owned the company. I still owned the house. I still had my pension and my Navy retirement. Richard had taken the liquid cash, but he had not touched the real assets. That was his first mistake. He was so focused on the quick score that he ignored the long game. He assumed I was too old and too tired to fight back. He assumed I would just accept the loss and fade away. He had no idea what I was capable of. That was his second mistake. I spent the rest of that day making a list. I wrote down every asset I owned. I wrote down every contact I had. I called George, my CFO, and I told him to start the process of evaluating a potential sale. George asked me if I was sure. I told him I had never been more sure of anything. I told him to keep it confidential. I told him not to tell Richard, not to tell anyone in management who reported to Richard. I told him to treat it like a classified operation. George laughed and said he had been waiting for me to do something like this for years. He said Richard had been running his mouth in the office, telling people he was going to take over soon. George said morale was low. People were worried about their jobs. I told George to tell them not to worry. If the sale went through, the new owners were good people. They would keep most of the staff. But I also told him to make sure Richard found out last. I wanted Richard to walk into the boardroom and realize the chair he had been trying to steal was already gone. I wanted him to understand that he had not inherited anything. He had lost everything because he could not wait a few more years for me to die. I wanted that lesson to stick. I wanted it to be the last lesson I ever taught him. That night, I did not sleep. I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon and watched the fireflies blink in the yard. I thought about Ellen. I thought about all the sacrifices we made to give Richard a better life than we had. I thought about how we scrimped and saved to send him to private school, how we paid for his college tuition out of pocket because we did not want him to have student loans. I thought about how we bought him a reliable car when he turned 16 and how he wrecked it within 3 months. We never made him pay for the repairs. We never made him work for the replacement. We gave him everything, and somewhere along the way, we turned him into a person who believed he was entitled to even more. I finished my bourbon and went inside. I opened a drawer in my nightstand and pulled out an old photograph. It was Richard at 8 years old, holding a fish he had caught on our first camping trip. He was grinning with pride. His front teeth were missing. His hair was a mess. He had a smudge of dirt on his cheek. I remembered that day like it was yesterday. The sun was warm, the lake was calm, and Richard looked at me like I was the greatest man in the world. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Then I put it back in the drawer and closed it. That boy was gone. That boy had grown into a stranger who saw his father as an obstacle. I could not bring that boy back, but I could make sure the stranger learned a lesson he would never forget. I got up the next morning, put on my best suit, and drove to Harold's office. We spent 4 hours going over the strategy. Harold suggested we take legal action to freeze the assets that Richard had transferred. He said we could frame it as a recovery effort, not a criminal complaint. He said the bank would cooperate if we presented the documentation. I agreed to that. I also told Harold to start working on the sale of my business. He raised an eyebrow at that. He asked if I was sure I wanted to give up the company I had built with my own hands. I looked him in the eye and said, I built it once. I can build something else, but I can't build another son. And I'm done trying. That was the day I decided to sell. That was the day I stopped being Robert Donovan, the father who forgave everything. I became Robert Donovan, the man who took back what was his. It was not about the money anymore. It was about the principle. It was about showing Richard that actions have consequences, that you cannot steal from your own blood and expect to get away with it. It was about showing Miranda, who was probably already spending my money on shoes and spa days, that she had backed the wrong horse. I wanted them both to understand that the world does not work the way they think it does. Hard work matters. Integrity matters. And respect is not a given. It has to be earned, day by day, year by year. I walked out of Harold's office with a plan. I drove back home and started making calls. I called the buyer that Sal had recommended. I called the bank to initiate the asset freeze. I called Patricia and thanked her for her honesty. She sounded relieved that I was not falling apart. I told her I was fine. I was better than fine. I was motivated. I was focused. I had not felt this alive in years. I looked in the mirror that night and saw a different man. My shoulders were back. My eyes were clear. I had a purpose. It was not the purpose I had planned for my golden years. It was better. It was a purpose that came from a place of strength, not weakness. Richard called again that evening. I did not answer. He left a voicemail. He said he was worried about me. He said I had not been returning his calls. He said he and Miranda had some exciting news to share. He said they were thinking about expanding their family. He was laying it on thick. He was trying to guilt me into picking up. I deleted the voicemail without listening to the whole thing. I had heard enough. I knew his tactics. I had used them myself when I was negotiating contracts. I knew how to recognize a sales pitch. And that was all I was to Richard now. A sales pitch. A mark. A soft touch to be squeezed for every last drop. I went to bed early that night. I slept like a log. I did not dream. I woke up refreshed and ready. I put on my work clothes, the jeans and flannel shirt I used to wear when I was on the shop floor. I walked out to my boat shed and started working on the water pump I had abandoned the day before. I fixed it in an hour. It was a simple job. I felt the satisfaction of using my hands. I felt the pride of solving a problem. That was who I was. That was who I would always be. Richard could take my money, but he could never take my skills. He could never take my memories. He could never take my legacy. And soon, he was going to learn that you do not steal from a man who has nothing left to lose. Because that man will fight back with everything he has. And I had plenty left. I had more than Richard could ever imagine. The sale of Donovan Machining took exactly 19 days from start to finish. 19 days of silence, of careful paperwork, of phone calls made in hushed tones from my den. I did not tell a single soul outside of Harold, George, and Sal. I did not tell my neighbors. I did not tell my fishing buddies. And I most certainly did not tell Richard. He was too busy living it up in Miami to notice that his father was quietly dismantling the empire he had assumed was his birthright. Every time he called, every time he left another desperate message about how he wanted to connect, I let it go to voicemail. I saved every recording. I knew I would need them later. Not for the lawyers. For my own peace of mind. The buyer was a conglomerate called Gulfstar Industries. They were based in Houston and had been trying to get a foothold in the aerospace supply chain for years. My company was exactly what they needed. We had the contracts. We had the reputation. We had the machinery that was so well maintained it ran better than most new equipment. Gulfstar CEO was a man named Edward Vance. He was my age, a veteran himself, and he understood the value of a handshake. We negotiated the deal over a period of 2 weeks. He flew to Fort Myers twice. The first time, we met at a diner near the airport. He ordered coffee and a piece of pie. We talked about the Navy, about the supply chain, about the changing market. He did not pressure me. He did not lowball me. He treated me with respect. The second time he came, we met at my office after hours. I walked him through the plant. I showed him the machines I had bought with my own savings. I showed him the maintenance logs that went back 30 years. I showed him the employees who had been with me since the beginning. He looked at everything carefully. He asked smart questions. He did not try to impress me with his jargon. At the end of the tour, he extended his hand and named a price. It was higher than I had expected. I asked him why. He said he was buying more than machines. He was buying a legacy. He said he wanted to keep the company's name intact. He wanted to preserve the culture. He said there were not enough old-line businesses like mine left in America. I shook his hand and accepted the offer on the spot. We signed the preliminary agreement that night. The final closing was set for 3 weeks later. That gave me enough time to prepare the transition. I worked with George to ensure every employee had a written offer from Gulfstar. I made sure their seniority was protected. I made sure their pensions were secured. I took care of my people. That was the only thing that mattered to me. Richard had never understood that. He had always viewed the employees as costs to be cut, as obstacles to be managed. He never learned that a company is not built on numbers. It is built on people. And people, if you treat them right, will carry you through anything. During those 19 days, I also worked with Harold to freeze Richard's assets. It was not as simple as I had hoped. The transfers had been made to a joint account in a different bank. That bank had to be notified. They had to review the documentation. They had to verify my identity and my ownership of the original funds. It took almost a week for them to respond. But when they did, they acted quickly. They placed a freeze on the joint account. They notified Richard and Miranda that their funds were unavailable pending a legal review. I imagine that was a shock. I imagine they were in the middle of buying something extravagant when the credit card was declined. The thought of it made me smile. George kept me updated on the office gossip. He said Richard was getting nervous. He had been asking questions about the due diligence teams that kept showing up in the building. He had tried to get into the conference rooms where the meetings were being held. Security turned him away. He had demanded an explanation from his assistant. She told him she did not have any information. He had stormed into George's office and demanded to know what was going on. George played dumb. He said he was just following orders from corporate. Richard asked which corporate. George said he did not know. Richard started shouting. He said he was the future CEO. He said he deserved to be included. George just shrugged and said he was sorry, but he had no instructions to include Richard in anything. I heard about that conversation and I laughed out loud. It was the first time I had laughed in weeks. I had been so focused on the details, so consumed by the process, that I had forgotten how good it felt to have the upper hand. Richard was used to being the smartest man in the room. He was used to manipulating situations to his advantage. He had never faced a situation where he had zero control. He had never been shut out of a decision that affected his own future. He was about to learn a very hard lesson about the difference between authority and entitlement. He had authority over nothing. He had entitlement in abundance. And neither of those things would save him now. The morning of the closing, I woke up at 4. I could not sleep. I was too excited. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch. I watched the sun rise over the mangroves. I listened to the birds waking up. I thought about Ellen. She would have been proud of me. Not for the revenge. She was never a vengeful woman. She was a peacemaker. But she would have been proud of me for taking control. For not letting Richard destroy everything we had built. She would have said something like, "Robert, you always knew how to handle a crisis." And I would have told her I learned it from her. She was the one who taught me that love and discipline are not opposites. They are the same thing. I got dressed in my best suit. I drove to the law firm where the closing was being held. Harold met me in the parking lot. He looked nervous. I asked him what was wrong. He said Richard had called him that morning. He did not know how Richard got his number, but he had called and demanded to know what was happening with the company. Harold had refused to give him any information. He told Richard that everything was confidential and that he would have to speak with me directly. Richard had hung up in a rage. Harold said he expected Richard to show up at the closing. I told him that was fine. I was ready for that. I had been ready for that since the day I saw my bank balance hit zero. The closing was held in a conference room on the 15th floor. There were lawyers, accountants, and representatives from Gulfstar. Edward Vance was there. He shook my hand warmly. He said he was honored to be taking over. I said the honor was mine. We sat down at a long table, and went through the documents. It took 2 hours. Every page was signed. Every dotted line was initialed. When it was finally done, Edward handed me a certified check for the full amount. I looked at the number. It was more money than I had ever seen in one place. I folded the check and put it in my breast pocket. I had no intention of depositing it right away. I wanted to hold it for a while. I wanted to feel its weight. Just as we were finishing, the conference room door burst open. Richard stormed in. He was red in the face. He was breathing heavily. He was wearing a designer suit that looked like it cost more than my first car. He had Miranda with him. She was wearing high heels and a dress that was entirely inappropriate for a business meeting. She looked furious. Richard pointed a finger at me and shouted, "What the hell did you do?" I did not answer. I just looked at him calmly. He turned to Edward and started yelling about fraud. He said he had been running the company for years. He said he had a right to be part of this. Edward looked at Richard with a mixture of confusion and disgust. He said he did not know who Richard was. Richard started listing his credentials. He mentioned his title as Vice President of Operations. He mentioned his salary. He mentioned his office on the executive floor. Edward listened politely and then turned to me. He asked if Richard was my son. I said yes. Edward asked if Richard had any legal ownership stake in the company. I said no. Edward nodded and turned back to Richard. He said, "I understand your frustration, but this transaction was approved by the sole owner of the company. That owner is your father. He had every right to sell. The deal is done. There is nothing you can do to stop it." Richard looked like he had been punched in the gut. Miranda started shouting something about lawyers and lawsuits. I ignored her. I stood up from the table. I walked over to Richard and put my hand on his shoulder. He flinched. I leaned in close and spoke in a low voice. I said, "You emptied my accounts, son. You took everything I had saved. You did not ask. You did not even tell me. You just took it. So I took something of mine back. I sold the company. I sold it to good people who will take care of my employees. And I did it because you taught me a valuable lesson. You taught me that blood means nothing if there is no respect. You taught me that I need to look after myself because nobody else will. That includes you." Richard tried to say something, but I held up my hand to stop him. I continued, "Your accounts are frozen. The money you took from me is being traced. You will not see a dime of it. You will not see a dime of anything I own. I have changed my will. I have set up a trust for my grandchildren, if you ever have any, but you and Miranda get nothing. You wanted my money so badly. You got it. And now you have nothing. That is called consequences. You are an adult. You made a choice. Now you live with it." Richard's face went pale. Miranda grabbed his arm and started pulling him toward the door. She was muttering about how they would fight this, how they would sue me for everything I had. I just smiled and told them they were welcome to try. Harold had already prepared a countersuit that would bury them in legal fees for years. They left the conference room in a huff. I walked back to the table and sat down. Edward looked at me with respect. He said, "That was handled well." I said it was a long time coming. We shook hands again, and I left the building. I walked out into the Florida sunshine and felt the weight of the check in my pocket. I felt lighter than I had in months. I had done it. I had taken back control. I had shown Richard that he could not treat me like a doormat. I had shown Miranda that her schemes had backfired spectacularly. I had sold a company that I built with my own 2 hands. And I had walked away with a smile on my face. I drove home and sat in my truck for a while. I looked at the house. I looked at the boat shed. I looked at the oak tree in the front yard that Ellen had planted when Richard was born. The tree was enormous now. It had grown strong and deep roots. I thought about the years I had spent nurturing it. I thought about the years I had spent nurturing my son. One had grown into something beautiful. The other had grown into something rotten. But that was not my fault. I had done my best. I had given Richard everything I had. He had chosen to throw it away. And now, he would have to live with that choice. That afternoon, I took my boat out for a long ride. I did not fish. I just cruised around the bay. I watched the dolphins play. I watched the pelicans dive. I felt the salt spray on my face. I felt the wind in my hair. I felt alive. I felt free. I had spent so many years worrying about the future, worrying about Richard, worrying about the company. I had forgotten what it felt like to just be. Now I remembered. It felt like peace. It felt like the quiet after a long storm. It felt like the beginning of something new. When I got back to the dock, I had a message from George. He said Richard had been removed from the building by security. He had tried to access his office, but his key card had been deactivated. He had caused a scene in the lobby. He had shouted that he would be back. Security had escorted him out. George said the employees were relieved. They had been walking on eggshells around Richard for years. Now they could breathe. Now they could focus on the transition without worrying about his volatile temper. I thanked George for the update. I told him to keep me posted if anything else happened. He said he would. I went home and made myself a simple dinner. Grilled fish, steamed vegetables, a glass of iced tea. I ate on the porch and watched the sun go down. My phone buzzed several times. Richard was calling again. I let it go to voicemail. Miranda called too. I let that go to voicemail as well. I knew what they wanted. They wanted to yell at me. They wanted to threaten me. They wanted to make me feel small. But I was not small anymore. I was a man who had just sold his life's work for a price that would make their heads spin. I had nothing to prove to them. I had nothing to fear from them. They were just noise. And I had finally learned how to turn off the noise. That night, I slept better than I had in years. I did not dream of Richard. I did not dream of money. I dreamed of Ellen. She was young again. We were at the lake. She was laughing. She was holding a fishing rod. The sun was warm. The water was clear. She looked at me and said, "You did the right thing, Robert." I woke up with a smile on my face. I knew she was right. I had done the right thing. Not because I had hurt Richard, but because I had saved myself. And sometimes, that is the only thing a man can do. The week after the sale was the quietest week of my adult life. I did not go to the office. I did not check emails. I did not answer the phone unless I recognized the number. I spent my days on the water and my evenings on the porch. I read 3 books. I fixed a loose shutter on the garage. I cleaned out the shed and threw away boxes of old receipts that had been gathering dust for decades. I did not think about Richard. I did not think about Miranda. I thought about the future. I thought about Alaska. I had always wanted to see the northern lights. Ellen had always wanted to go. We had talked about it for years, but something always got in the way. The business, the expenses, the timing. Now there was nothing in the way. I booked a flight for the following month. The peace did not last. It never does when you have a son like Richard. He showed up at my house on a Sunday morning. I was making coffee when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked out the window and saw his rental car. It was not a Tesla anymore. The bank had repossessed that. It was a cheap sedan, the kind you get at the airport when you're trying to save money. He got out of the car alone. He was not wearing a suit. He was wearing jeans and a polo shirt. He looked tired. He looked thinner. He walked up to the front door and knocked. He did not jiggle the handle. He just knocked and waited. I opened the door. I did not invite him in. I stood in the doorway and looked at him. He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. He said, "Dad, I need to talk to you." I said I was listening. He asked if he could come inside. I said no. He asked if we could sit on the porch. I said no. He looked at his feet for a long time. He shuffled his weight from one foot to the other. He looked like a little boy who had been caught stealing candy. But he was not a little boy. He was a grown man who had stolen $462,000 from his own father. I did not feel sorry for him. I felt tired. I felt disappointed. But I did not feel sorry for him. He started talking. He said he had made a terrible mistake. He said Miranda had pressured him. He said he had been scared about his future. He said he thought I was going to die soon and leave everything to charity. He said he was desperate. He said he was sorry. He said all the words that I had been waiting to hear for weeks. But they sounded hollow. They sounded rehearsed. I asked him if he had come here to apologize or to ask for money. He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. He was not sorry. He was broke. He had run out of options. He had come back to the only source of money he had ever known. He had come back to me. I told him I accepted his apology. I told him I forgave him. But I also told him that forgiveness did not mean I would give him another chance. I told him that trust, once broken, takes a long time to rebuild. I told him that I had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let him drag me down again. I told him that I was going to Alaska in 3 weeks. I told him I would be gone for a long time. I told him he needed to figure out his life without me. He started crying. He cried like a child. He begged me to reconsider. He said he had nowhere to go. He said Miranda had left him. He said he was living in a motel. He said he could not find a job. I listened to all of it. Then I closed the door. I leaned against the door and took a deep breath. That was the hardest thing I had ever done. Harder than boot camp. Harder than starting a business. Harder than watching Ellen die. I had to close the door on my own son. I had to let him fall. I had to let him hit the bottom. It was the only way he would ever learn. If I gave him a handout, he would just come back for more. If I bailed him out, he would never change. I had to be strong. I had to be the father he needed, not the father he wanted. And the father he needed was the one who said no. He sat in his car for an hour. I watched him from the window. He stared at the house. He stared at the porch. He stared at the oak tree. He did not knock again. He did not call. He just sat there. Finally, he started the engine and drove away. I watched his car disappear down the street. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was done. He had made his plea. I had made my decision. There was nothing left to say. I went back to my coffee. I went back to my quiet morning. I went back to my life. The next few days were a blur of preparation. I had to close up the house. I had to arrange for mail forwarding. I had to pack. I had to say goodbye to my friends. I had to sell the boat. That was the hardest part. I loved that boat. It had been my escape for 15 years. But I did not need it in Alaska. I would get another boat up there. Something smaller. Something for the lakes. I put the boat up for sale online. A young man named Charlie bought it within 3 days. He was a fishing guide. He said he would take good care of it. I believed him. He reminded me of myself 40 years ago, full of ambition, full of dreams. I also sold the truck. I did not need it anymore. I bought a used Subaru. It was 4-wheel drive. It was practical. It was the kind of car that made sense for the Alaskan wilderness. I packed my clothes. I packed my fishing gear. I packed Ellen's photo. I packed my bourbon. I did not pack much else. I was leaving behind a lifetime of possessions. I did not care about any of it. The house was going on the market. The furniture was going to charity. I was shedding my old life like a snake sheds its skin. It felt good. It felt necessary. It felt like the only way forward. The day before my flight, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Miranda. She had found my address somehow. The letter was written in elegant script on expensive stationery. She apologized for everything. She said she was sorry for the pain she had caused. She said she was sorry for encouraging Richard. She said she had been greedy and selfish. She said she was working a minimum wage job now. She said she was trying to rebuild her life. She asked me to reconsider my decision about the inheritance. She said she was pregnant. She said Richard was the father. She said she wanted her child to have a relationship with its grandfather. I read the letter 3 times. I felt nothing. No anger. No pity. No nostalgia. I felt nothing at all. I had seen too many manipulative people in my life to fall for another act. Miranda was a chameleon. She changed her colors to match her surroundings. She had been gold digging when she married Richard. She had been scheming when she encouraged him to steal from me. And now she was desperate. She was trying to use an unborn child as leverage. That was the lowest of the low. I folded the letter and put it in the trash. I did not respond. I did not call. I did not write back. I let silence be my answer. That night, I had dinner with Harold and his wife. They took me to a nice seafood restaurant on the water. We talked about the old days. We talked about the company. We talked about Richard. Harold's wife, a kind woman named Martha, asked me if I was sure about leaving. She said Florida was my home. She said I had friends here. She said I had a life here. I told her that Florida was just a place. My real life was elsewhere. My real life was waiting for me in a cabin on a lake. My real life was the quiet and the peace and the fishing. I told her I had never been more sure of anything. Harold raised his glass and made a toast. He said, "To Robert Donovan, the man who built an empire, lost a fortune, and walked away with his dignity intact." We clinked glasses. I felt a lump in my throat. I was not used to being celebrated. I was used to being the one who celebrated others. I was the boss. I was the father. I was the provider. I was not used to being the center of attention. But that night, I let myself enjoy it. I let myself feel proud. I had done something remarkable. I had taken a devastating blow and turned it into an opportunity. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up. And I had done it without bitterness, without hatred, without revenge. I had done it with grace. The next morning, I got in my Subaru and drove to the airport. I parked the car in long-term parking. I took one last look at Florida. The palm trees, the sunshine, the flat, endless horizon. It was beautiful. It had been my home for 40 years. But it was time to go. I walked into the terminal and checked my bags. I went through security. I found my gate. I sat down and waited for the boarding call. I felt a strange sense of calm. I was not nervous. I was not sad. I was excited. I was ready. The flight to Anchorage was long. I had a window seat. I watched the landscape change from green to brown to white. I watched the mountains appear on the horizon. I watched the glaciers and the rivers and the forests. It was like nothing I had ever seen. It was raw and wild and untamed. It was exactly what I needed. I landed in Anchorage and picked up a rental truck. I drove for 6 hours through the wilderness. I saw moose. I saw eagles. I saw mountains that made me feel small and insignificant and free. I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. The realtor had left the key under the mat. The cabin was perfect. It was small and rustic. It had a wood stove and a porch and a dock. It had a view of the lake and the mountains beyond. The water was so clear I could see the bottom. There was not another soul in sight. I carried my bags inside. I unpacked my things. I put Ellen's photo on the mantel. I poured myself a glass of bourbon. I sat on the porch and watched the sun set. The sky turned pink and purple and orange. The water reflected the colors like a mirror. The loons were calling across the lake. I had never heard anything so beautiful. I thought about Richard. I thought about the son I had raised. I thought about the man he had become. I did not know if I would ever see him again. I did not know if I wanted to. But I knew that I loved him. I would always love him. He was my son. I had given him life. I had given him everything I had. But I could not give him my future. I could not give him my peace. I had worked too hard for that. I had earned it. And I was not going to let anyone take it away from me. Not even him. I finished my bourbon and went inside. I built a fire in the wood stove. I made myself a simple dinner. I sat by the fire and read a book. I went to bed early. I slept through the night without waking up once. I did not dream of Richard. I did not dream of the company. I dreamed of Ellen. She was sitting on the porch with me. She was smiling. She was holding my hand. She said, "You did it, Robert. You found your way home." I woke up with the sunrise. I stepped outside and breathed in the cold, clean air. I was home. I was finally home. 3 months in Alaska changed me. I did not know a man could change so much at my age. I had always thought that by the time you reached 72, you were set in your ways. You were who you were. The mold was hardened. The clay was fired. But I was wrong. The wilderness has a way of stripping away the layers you have built over a lifetime. It peels back the pretense and the worry and the noise. It leaves you with nothing but the basics: food, shelter, fire, and the quiet voice of your own mind. I listened to that voice for the first time in years, and I liked what I heard. I spent my days doing simple things. I chopped wood. I fixed a leaky pipe under the sink. I built a new dock for my small rowboat. I learned how to identify the local fish. I learned how to avoid the bears. I made friends with a retired bush pilot named Frank who lived 10 miles down the lake. We would meet up once a week for coffee. He taught me how to read the weather. He taught me how to navigate the back roads. He taught me that the best way to live in Alaska was to respect it, to never take it for granted, to always be prepared. He was a good man. He had lost his wife 10 years ago. He understood what I was going through. I did not think about Richard every day. That was a relief. In Florida, he had consumed my thoughts. His betrayal was a wound that would not heal. But in Alaska, the wound started to close. The fresh air and the hard work and the solitude acted like a salve. I started to remember the good times instead of the bad. I remembered Richard as a little boy. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bike. I remembered taking him to his first baseball game. I remembered the look of wonder on his face when he saw the ocean for the first time. Those memories were precious. I did not want to lose them. I did not want the anger to erase them. Frank asked me about my family one evening. We were sitting on his porch, watching the northern lights dance across the sky. I had never seen anything so beautiful. The colors were impossible: green and purple and pink, swirling like living things. Frank poured me a cup of coffee and asked if I had any children. I told him I had a son. I told him what Richard had done. I told him about the money and the company and the betrayal. Frank listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly. He said, "I had a son too. He died in a car accident 20 years ago. He was 19. I would give anything to have him back, even if he emptied my accounts." I did not know what to say to that. I just sat there in silence. Frank looked at me and said, "You have a choice. You can hold on to the anger and let it fester, or you can let it go and remember the boy you raised. The man he became is not your fault. You gave him everything. What he did with it is on him." Those words hit me hard. I had been so focused on the betrayal that I had forgotten about the boy. I had forgotten that Richard was not born selfish. He was made that way by a world that told him he deserved everything without working for it. I had played a part in that. I had given him too much. I had protected him from too many consequences. I had made him weak. And now, he was paying the price for my mistakes. I wrote Richard a letter that night. It was the first time I had reached out to him since the sale. I did not know if he would read it. I did not know if he would care, but I needed to write it. I needed to say the words out loud, even if they were only on paper. I told him that I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I needed to move on. I told him that I still loved him. I told him that I hoped he was okay. I told him that if he ever wanted to talk, I would listen. But I also told him that I would not give him any more money. I told him that he had to find his own way. I told him that was the only way he would ever grow up. I mailed the letter the next day. I did not expect a response. I did not wait for one. I went back to my routine. I fished. I chopped wood. I read books. I watched the seasons change. The summer in Alaska was short but spectacular. The sun barely set. The days were endless. The flowers bloomed in colors I had never seen. The salmon ran in the rivers. The bears came down to the shore to catch them. I watched from a safe distance. I felt like a guest in a world that was far older and wiser than I was. I felt small, but I did not feel insignificant. I felt like I was part of something bigger. In September, the weather turned. The leaves changed. The air got crisp. The first snow fell on the mountaintops. I started preparing for winter. I stacked firewood. I insulated the cabin. I bought supplies from the general store in the nearest town. It was a 2-hour drive on a gravel road. The town had 100 people. They were friendly and tough and self-sufficient. They welcomed me into their community. I helped an old woman fix her roof. I helped a young couple build a fence. I joined the town council for a potluck dinner. They treated me like I had always been there. That was the best gift of all. To be accepted. To belong. I heard from George in October. He called to tell me that the company was doing well. Gulfstar had kept their promises. They had not laid anyone off. They had invested in new equipment. They had expanded the plant. George said morale was higher than ever. He said Richard had tried to apply for a job there. He had been turned down. He said Richard was still living in a motel. He said Miranda had moved to California with her new boyfriend. He said Richard was alone. I thanked George for the update. I told him I was glad the company was thriving. I did not ask about Richard. I did not want to know the details. I had let him go. But Richard did not let go of me. He called the cabin phone. I did not know how he got the number. I answered it anyway. It was the first time I had heard his voice in months. He sounded different. He sounded older. He sounded tired. He said, "Dad, I got your letter." I said I was glad. He paused for a long time. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the background noise of a television in his motel room. He said, "I'm sorry. I mean it this time. I'm really sorry." I believed him. Something in his voice had changed. The arrogance was gone. The entitlement was gone. He sounded broken. But sometimes, broken is the first step toward getting better. He told me about his life. He was working at a car dealership. He was making minimum wage plus commission. He was living in a single room. He had sold most of his clothes. He had sold his watch. He had sold his cufflinks. He said he had never been so scared in his life. He said he realized that he had taken everything for granted. He said he understood now why I sold the company. He said he understood why I left. He said he did not blame me. He said he blamed himself. He said he was going to therapy. He said he was trying to become a better person. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. I just listened. When he finished, I told him I was proud of him. Not for what he had done, but for what he was trying to do. I told him that change was hard. I told him that I had changed too. I told him that I was happy in Alaska. I told him that I had found peace. I told him that I loved him. He started crying again. But this time, it was different. It was not the crying of a man who wanted something. It was the crying of a man who had finally understood something. He said, "I miss you, Dad." I said, "I miss you too, son." That was the first honest conversation we had had in years. We talked for an hour. We talked about nothing important. The weather, the fishing, the snow. We did not talk about the money. We did not talk about the company. We did not talk about Miranda. We just talked. It felt natural. It felt right. When we hung up, I felt a warmth in my chest that I had not felt in a long time. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was something simpler. It was hope. I hoped Richard would find his way. I hoped he would become the man I had always believed he could be. And for the first time, I believed that he might. Winter came in full force. The lake froze over. The snow piled up. I stayed inside for days at a time. I read books. I wrote in a journal. I cooked hearty stews. I watched the snow fall through the window. It was peaceful. It was quiet. It was exactly what I needed. I did not feel lonely. I felt content. I had Frank for company. I had the town for community. I had the wilderness for solace. I had everything I needed. And I had hoped that Richard called every Sunday. It became our routine. He told me about his week. He told me about his therapy sessions. He told me about the small victories. He had gotten a small promotion at the dealership. He had started saving money. He had paid off his credit card debt. He was not out of the woods yet, but he was making progress. I could hear the change in his voice. It was subtle, but it was real. He was starting to understand what mattered. He was starting to value the things that could not be bought. And I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he would be okay. I did not offer to help him financially. He did not ask. That was the most important part. He was learning to stand on his own. He was learning to be independent. He was learning that the world does not owe him anything. It was a hard lesson, but it was the lesson he needed to learn. And he was learning it. I was proud of him. I told him that every time we talked. I told him that I believed in him. I told him that he was stronger than he knew. I told him that he was worthy of love. I told him that he was my son, and that would never change. Spring came slowly to Alaska. The ice on the lake began to crack and groan. The snow retreated from the trees. The first green shoots pushed through the muddy ground. I watched the transformation with the same wonder I had felt as a boy. The world was waking up. And so was I. I had survived my first winter. That was no small thing. I had learned to read the weather. I had learned to manage my firewood. I had learned to appreciate the small comforts of a warm cabin and a hot meal. I had learned that I was tougher than I thought. And I had learned that I could be happy alone. That was the greatest gift of all. Frank and I took a trip to the coast in April. He had a small float plane. He flew us over the glaciers and the fjords. I had never seen anything so majestic. The ice was blue. The water was black. The mountains were white and jagged. I felt like I was looking at the world before humans had touched it. It was raw and pure and untamed. Frank pointed out a pod of whales. They breached the surface and blew plumes of water into the air. I felt a lump in my throat. I thought about Ellen. I thought about how much she would have loved this. I thought about all the years we had talked about traveling. We had never done it. We had always been too busy, too focused on the business, too worried about Richard. I regretted that, but I did not dwell on it. I could not change the past. I could only enjoy the present. And the present was magnificent. We landed on a remote lake and spent the night in a small cabin Frank had built years ago. We cooked fresh fish over an open fire. We talked about life and death and everything in between. Frank told me about his wife. He told me about the day she died. He told me about the grief that had nearly consumed him. He told me that he had learned to carry it. Not to fight it. Not to hide from it. But to carry it like a backpack. It was heavy, but it was his. And it made him who he was. I understood that. I felt the same way about Ellen. She was gone, but she was still with me. In every sunrise. In every fish I caught. In every quiet moment on the porch. When I returned to my cabin, I found a letter waiting for me. It was from Richard. He had sent it to the general store, and the owner had dropped it off. It was a thick envelope. I opened it slowly. Inside, there was a handwritten letter and a photograph. The letter was long. He wrote about his therapy. He wrote about his job. He wrote about the small steps he was taking to rebuild his life. He wrote about the guilt he carried. He wrote about his fear that he had ruined everything forever. He wrote about his hope. He wrote that he wanted to visit me. He wanted to see Alaska. He wanted to see the mountains and the lakes and the northern lights. He wanted to see his father. The photograph was of him. He was standing in front of the car dealership. He was wearing a work shirt with his name on it. He was smiling. Not the fake smile he used to wear at parties. A real smile. It reached his eyes. He looked healthier. He looked happier. He looked like a man who was trying. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I felt a mix of emotions. Pride, sadness, hope, love. I did not know if I was ready to see him in person. I did not know if I could handle the awkwardness, the tension, the memories. But I knew I could not ignore him. He was my son. He was reaching out. And I had to reach back. I wrote him a reply. I told him I would like to see him. I told him that he could visit in June, when the weather was at its best. I told him to bring warm clothes. I told him to bring his fishing rod. I told him there was a lot of ground to cover, but I was willing to try. I sent the letter and waited. I did not know if he would actually come. I had been disappointed so many times. But something felt different this time. I could sense it in his words. I could hear it in his voice during our Sunday calls. He was not the same man who had emptied my accounts. He was a man who had hit rock bottom and decided to climb back up. That took courage. That took strength. And I respected it. June came faster than I expected. Richard called to confirm his flight. He was flying into Anchorage. He was renting a car. He was driving up to the cabin. I told him to be careful. I told him to watch for moose. He laughed. He said he would. I spent the morning before his arrival cleaning the cabin. I made up the spare bed. I stocked the fridge. I baked a loaf of bread. I felt nervous. I felt like a teenager waiting for a first date. It was ridiculous. I was a 72-year-old man. But I could not help it. I wanted this to go well. I wanted to see my son. I wanted to believe that the damage could be repaired. He arrived in the afternoon. I heard his car on the gravel road. I went outside to greet him. He got out of the car and stood there for a moment. He looked around at the mountains and the lake and the cabin. He looked overwhelmed. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had grown a beard. He looked older. He looked worn. But he looked determined. He walked toward me slowly. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. He said, "Dad, I'm so sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted to say it in person." I walked up to him and put my arms around him. I hugged him. I had not hugged him in years. He felt thin. He felt fragile. But he felt real. I told him to come inside. I made him a cup of coffee. We sat on the porch and looked at the lake. We did not talk about the past. We talked about the present. He told me about his job. He told me about his therapy. He told me about the books he was reading. He told me about his plans for the future. He had started taking online courses. He was studying business management. He wanted to start his own small business someday. Something honest. Something he could be proud of. I listened and nodded. I could hear the sincerity in his voice. He was not looking for approval. He was looking for understanding. And I gave it to him. We spent the next week together. We fished. We hiked. We cooked meals. We sat by the fire at night and talked. We did not argue. We did not blame. We just talked. It was healing. It was necessary. It was the beginning of something new. On the last night of his visit, we sat on the porch and watched the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange. The lake was still. The loons were calling. Richard turned to me and said, "Dad, I don't expect anything from you. I don't want your money. I don't want your inheritance. I just want you in my life. If you'll have me." I looked at him and felt a wave of emotion. I told him that I would always have him. He was my son, and nothing could ever change that. He left the next morning. I watched his car disappear down the gravel road. I felt a sense of peace that I had not felt in years. Richard was going to be okay. He was not there yet. He still had a long road ahead of him, but he was on the right path, and that was all I could ask for. I went back inside the cabin. I poured myself a cup of coffee. I sat on the porch and watched the lake. I thought about my life. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. I thought about the highs and the lows, the victories and the defeats, the love and the loss. It had been a full life. It had been a hard life, but it had been mine, and I was grateful for every moment. I decided to start a new project. I was going to build a workshop behind the cabin. I was going to teach local kids how to weld. I had the skills. I had the time. I had the desire to give back. It was my way of honoring the life I had built. It was my way of leaving a legacy that was not tied to money or possessions. It was my way of making a difference. Frank agreed to help me. The town council offered to fund the materials. I felt a sense of purpose that I had not felt since I was a young man starting my first business. It felt good. It felt right. Richard called every week. He told me about his progress. He had gotten another promotion. He had moved out of the motel and into a small apartment. He was saving money. He was sticking to his therapy. He was doing the work. I could hear the pride in his voice. I told him I was proud of him. I told him that I loved him. He told me he loved me too. It was not a grand reconciliation. It was a slow, steady rebuilding. One phone call at a time. One visit at a time. One honest conversation at a time. It was not easy, but it was worth it. I think about Richard now, and I do not feel anger. I do not feel bitterness. I feel hope. I feel love. I feel the quiet satisfaction of a father who refused to give up on his son. It would have been easier to walk away. It would have been easier to cut him off completely. But that was not who I was. I was a man who believed in second chances. I was a man who believed that people could change. I was a man who believed that love, real love, was worth fighting for. And I had fought. I had fought for myself. I had fought for my son. And I had won. The workshop is almost finished now. I have 10 students signed up. They are eager and curious and full of questions. I teach them how to handle metal. I teach them how to be safe. I teach them how to take pride in their work. It is the same lesson I learned at the age of 25. It is the same lesson I try to teach Richard. He did not learn it then, but he is learning it now. And that is enough. That is more than enough. I look at the mountains and the lake and the sky. I look at the life I have built in this wild, beautiful place. I am grateful. I am peaceful. I am home. To anyone reading this, I offer this piece of advice. Do not let anyone steal your peace. Not your children. Not your spouse. Not your friends. You are the only one who gets to decide how your story ends. And your story is not over. Not by a long shot. There is always time to start over. There is always time to build something new. There is always time to forgive. And there is always time to love. It takes courage. It takes strength. But it is worth it. I promise you, it is worth it. So here I am. Robert Donovan, 73 years old. Fisherman. Teacher. Father. I have been through hell and back. And I am still standing. I have a son who is finding his way. I have a community that has welcomed me. I have a workshop that is full of promise. And I have a heart that is full of peace. It has been a long road. But it has been a good road. And I would not change a single mile of it. Not one. If you have made it this far, thank you. Thank you for listening to an old man's story. It means more than you know. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. There are more stories to tell, more lessons to share, more adventures to come, and I would be honored to have you along for the ride. So hit that button, leave a comment, let me know what you think. And remember, it is never too late to start over. It is never too late to be the person you were meant to be. That is the truth, and that is the only thing that matters.